Our speaker today is Dr. Rachel Wigginton. She is a senior environmental scientist at the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. She has an ecology PhD from UC Davis, studying invasive plants in tidal wetlands, and she facilitates the Delta Interagency Invasive Species Coordination Team. So without saying much more, I'll let Rachel go ahead and start her presentation.
Thanks so much, Randall. I'm going to share my screen. Just let me know if anything looks off about it.
You're good.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. As Randall said, my name is Rachel Wigginton, and I'm excited to speak with you all today about early detection and rapid response to invasive species in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. I really appreciated that audience poll just to get an idea of how familiar folks are with early detection and rapid response. So hopefully those who aren't very familiar will learn a lot about EDRR today. And for those who are really familiar, I hope that you learn some more about early detection and rapid response in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta specifically. Before we hop into that, I thought I would just very briefly introduce myself to you. As Randall said, I'm a senior environmental scientist at the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, which is a California state agency that works in coordination and collaboration with local communities to protect, enhance, and restore the Delta's economy, agricultural and working landscapes, and the environment. And my background is as a wetland scientist and a restoration ecologist, but I've had a large research focus on invasive plants in tidal wetlands, specifically working with invasive hybrid spartina in the San Francisco Bay, and then invasive Lepidium latifolium sort of across the Bay Delta system. And in my role with the Delta Conservancy, I've been really fortunate to focus on collaborative science issues in the Delta. And that's really where my focus on invasive species comes in, thinking about how we as different agencies, different nonprofits, different land managers can attack some of these complicated natural resource problems together. A quick overview of what I'm going to discuss today. Obviously, I'm most hoping to help you understand the importance of early detection and rapid response to invasive species. And I'm going to do this by giving you all a little context about the Delta as a system for those who are less familiar. We're going to discuss some of the common invaders and types of invasive species in the Delta. Then I'll quickly introduce the Delta Interagency Invasive Species Coordination Team before diving into an overview of early detection and rapid response and why it is useful by providing some illustrative examples of EDRR from the Delta. So lots to cover in about 30 minutes, but I'm excited to get into it. So let's start off with an overview of the San Francisco Bay Delta Estuary. Some of you are probably very familiar with this estuary, but for those who aren't, a good way to think about the hydrology of this system is as a series of bays meeting an inverted river delta. So we have the South San Francisco Bay, but predominantly the San Pablo Bay in the north, with water going through the Carquinez Strait into the Suisun Marsh, and then meeting the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers in the Delta, which if you think of a delta like the Mississippi River Delta, where the rivers spread out as they approach the coast, this is the inverse of that. And you'll see the legal delta and Suisun Marsh outlined in gray in the graphic to the right. And to orient you just a little bit more, we have Sacramento in the north up here, San Francisco down by the Golden Gate, the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River coming together at their confluence before moving into the Suisun Marsh. This is a really hydrologically connected system with oceanic influences from the bay and riverine influences from the delta. And if we zoom in on the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta just a little bit more, we will notice that this was historically a mosaic of aquatic and semi-aquatic habitats, as is really well demonstrated by this map to the right, which was developed by Whipple in 2014 for the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And you can see that the system historically was dominated by tidal and non-tidal freshwater emergent wetlands, which are shown in this map as the lighter shaded blue. In more recent years, the system has been largely modified for agricultural production, which is illustrated by the lighter pink colors in the map to the right. You can also really see the shift in land use type in this stacked bar graph to the left. So the different colors represent the different habitat types, and they're stacked up to create 100% of the land cover. And from the early 1800s, again, we see the system is really dominated by those freshwater emergent wetlands. But by the early 2000s, we have a big shift toward agriculture and really non-native ruderal systems. And these systems are really vulnerable to invasion because estuaries in general are hotspots for invasion. And one of the reasons for this is that estuaries are highly connected systems. In the map on the right, you see San Pablo Bay on the left and the Delta on the right with Sassoon Marsh in the middle. The red colors here are showing areas of high salinity, while the greens and blues are showing areas of lower salinity. So with this salinity gradient across the estuary, it's really easy to see the hydrologic connections across the system. And this is one of the things that makes estuaries highly vulnerable to invasion. In the Delta specifically, there are several other factors that have facilitated introduction of new non-native species, including things like ballast water transport. So ships come in through the Golden Gate into the San Francisco Bay and can travel all the way up to some of the ports in the Delta. And the ballast water inside these ships can potentially contain invasive species, or the ships might even have fouling organisms on the outside that are invasive species. There's also been a lot of habitat restructuring that's happened in the Delta to support both land use change and water use by citizens of California. And these changes can promote invasion. And then finally, there's a lot of recreational boating and fishing, horticulture, and releases from the pet industry, along with several other vectors of invasion that really impact the Bay Delta system. And for these reasons, the Bay Delta estuary is known globally as one of the world's most invaded estuaries. So this is a highly invaded system. It's a big problem for the Bay Delta. With that in mind, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the different types of invasive species that we find in the Delta. We know there are more than 200 non-native species that have invaded the Bay Delta, but in the Delta specifically, we have several big categories that we're concerned about. One of the first categories is floating and submerged aquatic vegetation. So in the top left image, you see ribbonweed or Vasillaria australis. This is a submerged aquatic plant, meaning it roots in the sediment at the bottom of channels. And this is a relatively new invader to the Delta system that we're concerned about. Another type of invasive plant that we have in the Delta are emergent or terrestrial plants. In the picture on the right, the top right, you see arundo or giant reed, which is a really common invasive plant in the Delta. And this invasive plant can form these really dense stands that make it really difficult for anyone to get in there and actually do treatment of the invasive species or even maintenance to some of the infrastructure that is adjacent to these invaded patches. We also have multiple species of invasive invertebrates in the Delta. In the bottom left, you see an image of the New Zealand mud snail, which is one of the smaller and cuter of the invasive species that we have in the system. And then on the bottom right, we have an example of one of the invasive invertebrates, or invasive vertebrates rather, in the system, so northern water snakes. So lots of different types of invasive species in the Delta, which makes sense as this is a highly invaded area. And these invasive species can have lots of different impacts on the system. So not only can they impact things like boating and recreation. So in the picture to the left, you see invasive water hyacinth in a Delta channel, and it's clear from this image that it would be really difficult to do a lot of things in the area of the channel that is invaded by this floating aquatic vegetation. We also see damage to infrastructure from invasive species. So in our previous example of arundo, it's been documented that these really dense stands of arundo can actually keep folks out of areas that they need to get into to do important levee maintenance in the Delta. Invasive species can also change food web structure, which is a common impact of invasive species across different systems. But in the Delta, we see things like our northern water snake preying on native species, or invasive plants actually introducing new food subsidies into the system. Invasive species can alter ecological conditions that impact native species. So for example, changing the water clarity in a system if you introduce an invasive clam that is really good at filtering the water. And all of these impacts from invasive species that are established in the system and require long-term management can really result in adding up of costs, both in time of person power going out and trying to manage these invasive species, and just in the actual cost of paying those folks, paying for supplies. It really starts to add up quickly. And because invasion is such a widespread and complex problem in the Delta, in 2013, a group formed calling itself the Delta Interagency Invasive Species Coordination Team, commonly referred to as the DIISC Team because that's quite a long title. And the DIISC Team is the goals are to bring together groups that are working in the Delta to detect, prevent, manage invasive species, or to restore habitats that have been invaded. And the Conservancy has historically facilitated this group, along with co-chairs from the Delta Stewardship Council, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Department of Water Resources. And the DIISC team has several different activities that go towards meeting our goals. And the three main types of activities that we do are to exchange information. And this occurs through our quarterly meetings where all the different groups come together and brief the group about the types of invasive species management activities they're working on currently. We also work to leverage funding, and that funding is usually used in support of research or management needs that the group has identified as important to the Delta as a region. And one such need that was identified by the DIISC team is a need to better coordinate our early detection and rapid response activities in the Delta. And early detection and rapid response being the main topic of this talk, I'll be referring to it throughout as EDRR when I'm talking about the whole process. So what is early detection or rapid response, or EDRR? Well, in essence, this is a coordinated set of actions that aims to find and report and then eradicate potential invasive species before they have the chance to establish and cause some sort of harm in the system. And one of the best ways that I've found to conceptualize the EDRR process is by looking at our traditional invasion curve, which I'm going to show you in the graphic to the right. So on the x-axis here, you have time, and on the y-axis, you have spatial extent. So in the first phase of invasion, which is colonization, we have an introduction event. And for a certain period of time, the invasive species is occurring on the landscape at really small spatial extents. And this is the window where eradication is really possible and also cost effective. But the difficulty in this phase is actually detecting the invasive species, considering the fact that there just isn't very much out on the landscape yet. Once we move past the colonization phase, we enter the phase of establishment. And in this period, the invasive species spatial extent increases really quickly over a relatively short period of time. And during this establishment phase, eradication is still possible, but it's going to take a really large amount of effort and commitment of resources to get out on the landscape and make sure that we're removing all the different populations of an invasive species as it is rapidly spreading. Once we leave the establishment phase, we move into the spread phase. And this is where, as managers, our focus shifts from eradication and containment to long-term control and maintenance. And this is where those costs really start to add up. This is also generally the phase of invasion where public awareness begins to increase. And this totally makes sense because this is the phase of invasion where we're really starting to see a whole lot of the species out on the landscape. So when we refer to early detection and rapid response, what we're really talking about are any of the actions that we can take during the highlighted time period here after the introduction of a novel invader, where we can eradicate them before they establish and spread. So now that we understand a little bit more about what EDRR is and what it intends to accomplish, we can look at the key elements of a successful EDRR program. So there are 4 key elements to a successful EDRR program. They include preparedness, early detection, rapid assessment, and rapid response. And these framework elements are strongly based on the Department of Interior's EDRR framework, which they put forward in 2016, as well as a 2020 special issue of the scientific journal Biological Invasions, which was focused on EDRR. And we can see that there are steps that are connected, but one of the most important things to think about is to have any of these different elements be successful. We have to have adequate information provided to authoritative decision makers in a really timely manner so that we can get out into the system, coordinate our response, so talk to neighboring landowners, talk to neighboring jurisdictions, and set the stage for an effective rapid response and eradication effort. And because there are so many different agencies, as Doug showed when he gave that multiple choice example at the beginning, listing just a few of the Delta agencies that are already out in the system doing invasive species management, the DIISC team was really aware that there was a lot of early detection and rapid response work already happening in the Delta. So the first step from our perspective was that information and planning step. What sort of resources do we already have that we can capitalize on? So in order to assess this, we developed a draft EDRR coordination table, which was developed based on a draft invasive species management coordination table that was a little bit more generalized for the Delta region. And we cataloged all the different EDRR resources that exist that apply to the Delta. So this is everything from individual agencies having EDRR plans for their restoration sites, so site level EDRR plans, to agencies having coordination plans for how they're going to interact with folks in different jurisdictions, down to just resources that allow the public or land managers to quickly and accurately report a detection of a new invasive species. So we cataloged all these different EDRR resources and organized them based on those different framework elements that we discussed before. And what we found was that we have a lot of resources in the Delta that help us with preparedness and early detection specifically. However, we have far fewer resources for rapid assessment and rapid response to these novel invasions. Similarly, we found that there were lots of different organizations, so agencies, nonprofits, land management groups that were involved with preparedness and early detection, but far fewer organizations that had the expertise or the authority to participate in rapid assessment or rapid response activities. So this was really a useful starting place for the DIISC team because it allowed us to understand what was already out in the system and how we could potentially, using our facilitation role, to coordinate and connect different folks who were doing similar work out in the Delta. So now that we know there are a lot of these EDR activities in play, we can start to hone in on some examples of from the different EDRR elements that occur in the Delta. And I just want to take a quick moment because I know someone in the audience is thinking it. Prevention of invasive species entering the system is critical. It's generally considered outside of the early detection and rapid response process, but it's critical that prevention activities inform our EDRR work. And this is because, again, the long-term management of invasive species in the system is extremely costly. I'll keep beating that drum. But beyond that, prevention is critical because it allows us to not have to deal with the ecological outcomes of having an invader get integrated into a system. And there's multiple prevention efforts across the state of California that really benefit the Delta. So first, we have examples from ballast water discharge regulations and sampling that are run by the State Lands Commission. And these regulations apply to those big shipping containers and those ships that are coming up into the ports in the Delta thinking about how we can discharge that water in a location that makes it less likely to result in a new invasion, and then also sampling that ballast water to really understand how big of a problem this invasion pathway is. We also have plant nursery inspections. There's several different programs for this. You all heard, for those who were in the webinar earlier this week, about Plant Right. That is one of the programs. There's other programs, some funded by the California Department of Food and Agriculture, that go into plant nurseries and help to educate these folks about not felling invasive plants and to take those species off the shelves. We also have border checkpoints, again, run by the California Department of Food and Ag. So if you've traveled to and from the state of California, you've probably driven through one of these border checkpoints, where they're really specifically looking to detect and prevent the introduction of agricultural pests. And finally, prevention activities include things like boater education and checkpoints, making sure recreational boaters aren't moving invasive species from one location to another. And that's a really good transition into how the public can help with prevention. There's several different ways. The first is that you can learn about what invasive species could impact your area so that you're really prepared to spot an invasive species or to know not to bring it into a system. Again, don't be a vector of invasion by cleaning and drying your gear between uses. So things like boats and boots can be vectors of invasive species when you're out recreating on the landscape. Think critically about the species that you purchase and plant around your home, and then don't release pets into natural systems. This can be a big strain on native species where invaders can outcompete native species. A common example of a released pet is, of course, a red-eared slider. So now that we've talked a little bit about prevention, let's dive into the 4 key elements of a successful EDRR process and highlight the importance of these with some examples of things going on in the Delta. So first, let's talk about preparedness, which feeds into all the other aspects of the EDRR process. And preparedness establishes plans, maps, coordination and communication networks, develops tools, trainings, and resources that are necessary for EDRR actions, basically preparing us really well to be able to act when a new invasive species comes on the scene. And a really good example of implementing these sorts of preparedness activities comes from the State Parks Division of Boating and Waterways, or DBW. They are the primary organization responsible for aquatic invasive plant control in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh, and an important member of the DIISC team. And in 2018, they developed a set of collaborative guidelines for Delta aquatic invasive plant control. So not just EDRR, but the whole process of aquatic invasive plant control. And this document not only lays out steps that DBW itself wants to take, it talks about how to coordinate with other agencies, and these collaborative guidelines were vetted and given feedback by lots of different other agencies. And the document also crosswalks important policy and planning documents and pulls out the portions that are really critical to the management of aquatic invasive plants. And the collaborative guidelines have 9 objectives, which you can see here, including coordination and collaboration, prevention, early detection and rapid response, long-term management, education and outreach, research, thinking about our laws and regulations, and finally considering aquatic invasive plants in the context of ecosystem restoration. And this image to the right, I think, really demonstrates the extent of the problem that DBW is tackling. Aquatic invasive plants are widespread in the Delta, but it's not just the spatial extent that's challenging, it's also really challenging to effectively treat these species to manage and eradicate them. And because it's so hard to treat these species once they're already established, I want to focus in on the first 4 objectives here, which are really relevant to our EDRR efforts in the Delta. Not only in these 9 objectives does DBW lay out how they want to act, they also lay out lots of resources that they feel would improve the early detection and rapid response efforts that are going on as it pertains to aquatic invasive species. For example, the need to have a watch list of potential invasive species. folks are generally pretty good at identifying the species that they expect to be in the system, but we are often less well prepared to correctly and confidently identify species that are new to the system. So having a watch list of species that we expect could be introduced allows us to train teams that are out on the water in identifying these species. And this is where the DIISC team feels like they can come in and assist with developing some of these resources, such as watch lists, such as training materials, or even help DBW build on the resources that they have already developed. Next, we're going to move into early detection, which coordinates monitoring activities so that an initial occurrence of a potential invasive species is quickly reported and the species identity is verified, so we know what we're dealing with. And a really good example of this in the Delta, but generally across the state of California, are weed management areas. Weed management areas are local stakeholder collaborations which focus on invasive plant control specifically. They are funded by the California Department of Food and Agriculture's Noxious Weed Management Account, and they are most often coordinated by the county agricultural commissioners, though sometimes they are coordinated by different actors such as the resource conservation districts, and these all occur at the county level. And a really good example of how these weed management areas work is that they set these regional goals and targets for species that they want to be proactively planning for and treating. So in the image to the right, you'll see an Instagram post from the Yolo County Resource Conservation District, where they are highlighting the Yolo County weed management area's target weed species, one of which is Russian knapweed. In this post, they give information about how to identify the species and also information on what to do if you do find a population of this species on land that you manage. And this is an excellent example of educating the folks in the system and providing a mechanism for them to detect the species and report it. And the public can also really help with early detection. So the first thing you can do, just if you see something that seems like it's new to the system, try to figure out what the species is and then report it appropriately. Land managers, if they find a new weed, can communicate directly with weed management area coordinators. And you can also report agricultural pests to the California Department of Food and Ag. They have a 1-800 number on their website, but then they also have a really cool smartphone app called Report a Pest. And you can report other invaders to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Also, they have an online form you can fill out, but I think the EdMaps smartphone app is really useful because it allows you to report the species and then actually geolocate where you found the species, which is really important information for the next steps of the EDRR process, which are rapid assessment and rapid response. So rapid assessment determines the distribution and abundance of species. We evaluate the potential risks of the introduction of the species. So is it going to cause significant harms to the environment, to the economy, to the health of the system? And if we determine, yes, this is a potentially harmful species, we move into the rapid response step, which helps coordinate actions to eradicate a new potential invasive species, again, before it becomes established and causes long-term harm. And one of the best examples that we have of successful rapid assessment and rapid response comes from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's response to invasive nutria. Many of you have probably heard of invasive nutria. It is a large semi-aquatic rodent, which is native to South America. It can occupy fresh or slightly salty waters, and it was introduced into the United States in 1889 as part of the fur trade. I think there was some regret there. So by 1970, it was declared eradicated in California. So we had gotten rid of the nutria population. However, by 2017, a population was rediscovered on a managed wetland in Merced County. And since 2018, nutria have been found in several different California counties, including San Joaquin County, which is a county associated with the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And we know that nutria have negative impacts on the system. First of all, they consume vegetation So they can eat about 25% of their body weight every single day. But in addition to eating a lot of vegetation, they're also kind of messy eaters. So they destroy up to 10 times more vegetation than what they consume. So this can not only create devegetated areas that are then subject to things like erosion, but if the nutria is feeding on an invasive plant, it can actually create a whole bunch of propagules in the water that can then be transported down to other locations. In addition to this, nutria burrow, and these burrows, especially if they happen in levees, can cause a lot of damage to that infrastructure, which can then impact streams and rivers in the system. And because we have a really well documented and strong understanding of the negative impacts of nutria, that rapid assessment step when nutria were first identified in California again was able to proceed really quickly. So we had cataloged a lot of that information already about nutria. So we were able to pass through that rapid assessment step with a lot of speed and a lot of information under our belts, and move into the rapid response part of the EDRR process. And the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has been leading this effort by using a grid searching method. So this is a really intensive process where they're dividing any areas where they think nutria could be occurring into 40-acre grid cells, and then intensively searching those grid cells using boating, kayaking, walking, or driving, depending on the landscape where they're searching. And they're not just looking for visual confirmation of nutria, they're looking for scat and tracks, and they even have game cameras out in the system where they can take pictures of nutria as they come up to these camera platforms. And because of our quick response and this extensive rapid response effort, the Department of Fish and Wildlife has seen nutria take, so the number of nutria that they're capturing during this intensive searching, dropping. So it seems like we're really getting the population of nutria knocked down in the system. So between 2020 and 2021, the number of nutria taken has dropped by nearly half. And that's the case even with the area that CDFW is surveying increasing. So that's a really good sign, and I think a really strong testament to how having a really intensive rapid assessment where we have a lot of information that leads into a well-supported rapid response can really successfully control an invasive species population. And obviously, as I just described, that's a lot of work that's going on. So led by CDFW, but supported by many different organizations, including the Delta Conservancy. So having gone through the different steps of the EDRR framework from early detection all the way through to rapid response, we can see that all these efforts really require proactive coordination and communication among all groups, from public to agency scientists to invasive species managers. And there's already a lot of really good EDRR work happening in the Delta. And the DIISC team is excited to continue to try to make some connections between groups doing this important work so that we can all be more effective moving forward. Also, just want to note that invasion prevention, again, is the most effective for preventing ecological harm and preserving our monetary resources that can go toward invasive species management. And if you can't prevent a species from entering the system, early detection and rapid response are critical to actually being able to mitigate the impacts of invasive species. So with that, I think I will just pop my contact information up here for a moment. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Find me on the internet. And with that, I think I have a few minutes to take questions from the audience. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Hey, Rachel, thanks for the talk. Yeah, we have a couple of questions. The first is from Thomas, and he wants to know how much of the converted wetlands to agriculture is still considered wetland?
Such a good question. So I think if you're looking for a percentage, I won't be able to give you one off the top of my head, but we do have only a small amount of remaining wetlands in the system. There's been a lot of efforts over recent years to restore the wetlands in the Delta, but it is largely a modified system. And thinking about it as I often like to think about it as from the reconciliation ecology perspective. So lots has changed, and it's very unlikely we're ever going to get back to where we were before, if we would even exactly want to do that. So thinking about how we can best improve the ecological health of the system and restore some of those key habitats that we've lost. So sorry for that non-answer, Thomas, but I would be happy to look that up and get back to you if you want to shoot me an email.
Thanks, Rachel. Next question is from Dale. He's asking, is not cleaning gear confined to aquatic environments?
Could you repeat that, please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, is not cleaning boots and gear between sites confined to aquatic environments?
Yeah, such a good question. So I think of it a lot from the aquatic perspective, obviously because of my work, but it's totally not confined to aquatic systems. So a real classic example are those sticky seeds that get on your socks or stick into your boots when you're hiking. Those can often be from invasive species. So especially if you're moving big geographic areas, so going from hiking in SoCal to going to hiking in Oregon or something like that, you especially want to make sure you're looking at your boots, looking at your gear, and removing any potential seeds that you could be transporting. And it doesn't just have to be your boots. I think that can cross apply to a lot of your gear. So just thinking critically about where you've been and where you're going and trying to prevent any of those introductions where you can.
That's great to keep in mind. Next question is from Donald. Is there information about how the rate of invasion over all taxa has changed over time? Is it speeding up or slowing down?
So I assume they mean in the Delta. It's a complicated question, I think, because the pathways to invasion are sort of changing even as we speak. So I'm thinking specifically about climate change and how climate change can impact the types of species that do well in different systems, and not just species that are introduced from far away, but native species that perhaps once occupied a certain area, but now because of changing climatic conditions are able to occupy a different area. And so overall rates of invasion, I don't think I can speak to that specifically. But I would say that from our known vectors that we have been doing a lot to try to limit those. So a lot of those shipping introductions that I talked about earlier. So from ballast water, from fouling organisms, I think that those have slowed down because we're so much more aware of them. But there is still, we just live in a globalized world where there's lots of invasion pressure and lots of potential for introductions to happen in lots of different ways. So yeah, I think that we're doing a good job of slowing down the pathways that we know about, but I think because of the world changing, there's always new pathways that we're discovering. So optimistically, I would like to say yes, but I think realistically, it's sort of a yes and.
All right, and next question is from Claire. How can we do a better job of communicating EDRR success? I feel like the general public rolls their eyes at every watch for the species message, and they get burned out looking for killer bees, rodents of unusual size, and then feel like it was a fuss for nothing when it was actually successful.
Oh man, that's an excellent question. So I love thinking about science communication in general. And I totally agree that there can be a level of burnout when we're hearing about the same topics, or if we're trying to get the same level of alarm from people over and over again. So I feel like one way that we can communicate is just to help people understand the ways that they can participate. Something that I've heard from a lot of folks since I started working on this, because I have only really started working on EDRR since I came to the Delta Conservancy and started my role with the DIISC team. But what folks are often really struggling with is just who to report these species to, because we have lots of really informed naturalists in California who are really passionate about getting out on the landscape. And so I think just the first step is helping folks have a really clear understanding of how they can report. And making folks feel like that reporting is actually doing something. That's also a concern. It's like, okay, I put it in this app, but like, who's getting it? Like, how often is it being checked? Some of those types of concerns. As far as communicating EDRR success, another really good question, because I think it's challenging. We want to be really thoughtful about the type of rhetoric we're using around invasive species. We don't want to, lean on any sort of like trite things. But I think that when we successfully eradicate or exclude a species, that can be a big cause for celebration, particularly if you have a eradication effort that's followed by a restoration effort, which is a really good site level EDRR activity to do active plant restoration that excludes new invaders from coming into the system after you've eradicated the invasive species that you're targeting. So not just showing like, hey, we got rid of this species, but showing, hey, we got rid of this invader that was causing harm, and look how much our natural systems were able to recover and improve because of these efforts. So I think, yeah, just communicating those successes, not just in the eradication sense, but in what happens after eradication, like what was the purpose of that eradication and what were the positive things that came out of it.
Good point. I'm going to jump in just because I think Nikki's system froze. A couple questions here. What can you remind us again of the name of the app or apps for reporting possible invasive species?
Yeah, so the CDFW one that they have given talks on to the DIISC team, which is my primary knowledge about it, is the ED maps. And this is not just in California, but there is a California specific app. And that one allows you to go in and, as I said, actually drop a pin or you found the species, take a picture, which is really useful. And then for agricultural pests, CDFA, so the California Department of Food and Ag, has a report a pest app. So both those can be really helpful. And then in addition, both those organizations also have either a 1-800 number or a online form that you can fill out. So I like the smartphone apps, but I know not everyone is on that train. So there's other options as well.
Great. And I would throw out there too that there's an effort. I mean, iNaturalist is a common thing for people to use. It's easy to use, and we're trying to make sure that any relevant reports from iNaturalist get grabbed and seen that could be early detections.
Yeah, we actually have, that is another great example that we have, that table I showed where it was enumerating all the different resources. We have iNaturalist on there as well, which is a really great one, and just like a fun app to use in general.
Definitely. So Adriana found EdMaps West, which I know is for the Western US. There's a specific one for California. Do you happen to know the URL for that? If not, we'll Google it and, excuse me,
yeah,
share that in the chat.
I don't have it pulled up, but
okay.
I can find it and send it to you, and then we can.
And it's through the California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, so if you go to CDFW's page, if you Google like CDFW invasive species, they'll have a hyperlink to the EdMaps app. So that was probably the most effective way to find it.
Perfect. And EdMaps is a national system. This is a specific app that's loaded up with species that you might find in California. And Rita asked, can the apps to report invasive species only be used in the Delta or in all of California?
Definitely all of California.
Perfect. Christine asks, for developing the watch list for potential invasives in the Delta, is there a list of criteria used to determine which organisms could potentially become invasive?
So this is a really excellent question and is actually relevant to an example I didn't have time to give, which is the National U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is performing a series of activities to create watch lists. So they have a process that they've established that they take a group of stakeholders, they're dividing it by their region. So we in California are in a region with Washington and Oregon along the West Coast. And they brought together a group of stakeholders, and I was in attendance for that. And they essentially asked us to identify not just species that we were concerned about, but pathways that we were concerned about, and then like species groups. So if you think, sometimes we not know what a specific species we're concerned about, but we're like, okay, we know that this genus of aquatic plant is readily invading our system. That's something we're really concerned about. And they take all that information from the stakeholders, and then they compare it against criteria that they've developed, things like climate, hydrologic connectivity, stuff like that. And they are developing a watch list, which they will then break down in a way that we ask. So they can do it by like governmental jurisdiction, but we've actually asked them to do it by watershed, which I think will be really helpful for the Delta specifically, because then we can take that little subset of the watch list and use it as our general watch list, or maybe as a starting point where we as like the local experts can then go in and add a few if we feel like things were left off. So that's really, I think, one of the great things about the DIISC team is that we are able to connect up with these bigger efforts that are going on and say, okay, how can we extract information from this that can really help us with the Delta? Because Fish and Wildlife Service, their invasive species officers come to our DIISC team meetings. So it's a really useful space to make sure that we're involved in those sorts of activities and can leverage resources at lots of different levels to give us these tools that we need for EDRR.
Excellent. Yeah, I know in the invasive species realm in general, there is a movement to try to identify things earlier, to scan the horizon, to figure out which things might be invasive in our area. And in terms of criteria, I know from plants, we're off the first and most important thing is, has this organism been invasive elsewhere, and particularly other places that look like California, because that's a red flag.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about similar climates and places that have, you know, potential to come to the system and things like that.
Well, if we have a second left, I have a quick question. I think we're out of audience questions, but it seems, I know that, you know, maybe a decade ago, when a new plant would come into be found in the Delta, like sponge plant, South American sponge plant, that it was tricky. There were barriers to response, including having appropriate permitting, et cetera. And I know a lot of progress has been made on that. And that's obviously going to be important for a rapid response. Can you say a little bit about those kind of challenges and how they're being addressed?
Yeah, definitely. So I agree that we've come a long way, but there's definitely still room for improvement. So the process now, I think, involves a couple key steps. So when a new species comes in, to get a positive identification, we have to coordinate with the California Department of Food and Agriculture to get a positive ID and say, yes, this is an invasive species. And then they are going to rank it. So like based on knowledge that they have, literature search, how concerned should we be about this invasive species? And then we have to go through a risk assessment process with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where they will not just look at the impacts of the species itself, but also think about what are our possible means of treatment, what are the impacts of those different treatments. And then after that, we can start to think about who has the jurisdictional authority to act to respond to these invasive species. So just laying it out, you can tell that's kind of a lot of steps. A lot of people have to be involved. So I think some of the best things that we can do to speed that up are to start to bring together the information that we're going to need to inform those assessments ahead of time. So when we have these watch lists and we've done our horizon scanning, then we can start to actually pull together the literature on those species, both on their ecological impacts, but also on potential treatments, since often that's an area for invasive species where we don't have as much information, like how do we effectively treat these species? So if we have a common place where we are consolidating that information ahead of time, I think that can really speed up our assessment processes. And then having some established communication that allows us to talk across jurisdictions, break down some of those silos, will help us in that rapid response. But of course, all that requires resources. So not just the resources to bring together that information ahead of time, which is like a research burden, but then also the resources to effectively respond. And I think one of the reasons the Nutria response has been so effective is because we had that information. We knew how harmful Nutria were, and because of their known impacts, a lot of resources, not just of money, but of staff, were very quickly diverted to that early detection and rapid response effort. So it makes sense because we had so much pre-knowledge about Nutria, but I think it really gives us a good example of how we could potentially react quicker in the future with other species by bringing together that information ahead of time in some sort of systematic way.
Great to hear that you're working on that. I know it's not easy with all those different agencies, not always designed to move quickly. There was one more question that came in. Randall, do we have time?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. So Adriana was asking, and I think this has a bit to do with sea level rise. Does saltwater intrusion affect the number of invasive species getting into the Delta?
Interesting. So I'd say in general, the hydrologic connection in the estuary, as I talked about at the top of my talk, is a factor in how invaded the system is. This is true of just systems that are at like low elevations, they're landscape catchments. As far as the saltwater intrusions specifically, I think that historically that's kind of how the system acted was, in drier years, it would be saltier, and wetter years, it would be fresher. So I don't think that specifically is causing more invasion. I do think it is interesting from a scientific perspective to think about how changes in salinity might impact the types of invaders that are present. So some species that are invasive now might not be able to hang out very well if things get saltier versus other species that might like it if it's saltier. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I definitely think sea level rise is a factor that the questioner has correctly identified there.
So it looks like we are coming up right at the end of our talk. I don't see any additional questions, so I'd certainly like to thank Dr. Wigginton for this fantastic presentation. I think we had a lot of interest and we're getting some good comments. And I'd like to thank everybody on the attendee side as well for tuning in. We get frequent questions about whether we will be posting the recordings from these, and the answer is yes. And if you look in the chat, Nikki has actually posted where all of the talks will be posted. So once again, thank you all for joining us. We've had some great talks this week, and we have even gotten some ideas from these talks as to what we may be able to do next year with the same event. So enjoy the rest of your week and weekend, and we look forward to having further conversations with all of you in the future.